Hi, so this is the third clip for this first session for the theoretical perspectives and key ideas in anthropology module. So this is the clip in which we actually begin to broach a few of the kind of theoretical questions that this module will be confronting throughout really its course. So what I really want to do is lay out a little bit of a framework, a kind of frame of reference, if you like, that we'll be returning to in different ways throughout the course as we examine the development of anthropological thinking in this quasi-historical way that I mentioned initially. I should say that I have set 2 required readings for today's session. This question of whether anthropology should be understood as a science or not, and this goes to the heart of some of the questions that I'll be discussing in this clip. And this very kind of a paper that's created a lot of waves in the past year in anthropology, speaking directly to questions of decolonialization or decolonialism or anti-racism within the discipline of anthropology by Ryan Cecil Jobson from Chicago in America. I've also put up on YouTube a clip of a discussion with Jobson and a number of other scholars working in America on this question, really trying to advance a radical critique, almost like a resetting, and allowing, if you like, of anthropology in its old frameworks to burn in order for a new anthropology, as they see it, to come out, to emerge from those ashes. It's a very interesting article, which I hope will be provocative and will raise issues that we'll be able to return to throughout the course. So let me begin by laying out what I would take the central problem that anthropological theory has had to deal with really since the inception of the discipline of anthropology, which is the problem of how to apportion similarity and difference in the phenomena that we study as anthropologists, social and cultural phenomena, let's say, for the sake of argument, right? So the way to set up the problem would be to contrast 2 positions that have the potential to be different enough from each other to be interesting one to the other, if you like, right? So the position A is the position of the anthropologist or the analyst, the person who sets up to understand some object of analysis that in some way is interesting to them because it goes beyond the things with which the anthropologist or the analyst is already familiar, already understands fully, and so on. Now, for a long time in anthropology, such objects of analysis were often labeled as, in some sense, other. So this self versus other problem. That's the concept of the other is, of course, a complex one and has a complex and intricate history. In debates today, often it is taken as a problematic word. The idea of othering the objects of study of anthropologists, somehow denying their humanity or denying the degree to which there are clearly similarities and points of recognition between the anthropologist and the people that they study. All of those kinds of implications of using the word other to describe the people that anthropologists study, and the kind of, if you like, colonial, possibly, overtones of the word are thoroughly critiqued at the present. I mention it here to kind of nod to that problematic history, but really to say that O in my diagram doesn't really stand so much for other as for object of analysis. And really the slot that can be taken by this object of analysis can be, if you think of it in traditional anthropological terms, say another culture or another society or another social group, one that the anthropologist might be unfamiliar with, one that is in a different part of the world, and so on. That reflects much of the history of anthropology. But equally well, the argument could run just as well by putting in the position of the object of analysis, say, someone who belongs to a different profession of one's own. So an accountant can be other to the analyst, in the sense that somehow their ways of acting and thinking go beyond what the analyst already knows about. One could extend it to the personal realm and say that one's partner, or one's parents, or one's children are other as objects of understanding for you, in the sense that they might go beyond the things that you already know. They might challenge you to rethink certain things that you might take for granted, and so on. In all these ways, they are opaque, if you like. There's another word that starts with an O, and therefore um, create the challenge of trying to understand them in some way. So this question of how to build a bridge, if you like, from the position A to position O, the bridge of understanding that arrow there, that going from the blue circle to the red circle, indicates, over a challenge of some kind of difference. Again, one word that is often used in anthropology to tag that difference is the word alterity, and that is sometimes felt to be problematic as well, for the same kinds of reasons that the word other can be problematic. It implies that somehow there's some kind of big gap between the anthropologist and the people that they're trying to engage with and understand, that might be exaggerated or might imply some kind of value difference, and so on. So that again can be problematic, but again, I want to steer away from those connotations and just simply point to the fact that anthropological investigations, analyses, and theorizing draw their interest from the possibility that what we're trying to understand, whatever that might be, whether it's far away from the environment that we ordinarily live, or whether it's part of that environment, whether it's part of our most intimate circle, poses a problem of opacity, of being unable initially to understand that object fully, right? So that question seems to me to be the central question that anthropologists have been dealing with since the 19th century and still today. And really, the question comes down to how to apportion similarity and difference in that relationship between position A and position O. How to recognize elements of similarity and how to understand elements of difference when you adopt these two perspectives. Now, as soon as you set up the problem in those terms, you've effectively, I think, provided the coordinates for what has been the central kind of contrast in anthropological theory, again, since its beginning in the 19th century as a professional discipline. I mean, you could argue that anthropology existed since ancient Greece. Some people say Herodotus was the first anthropologist. There's plenty of arguments saying that some of the greatest thinkers in Islam and in the Muslim tradition of thinking were thinking anthropologically, and so on. But when I say the beginning of anthropology, I mean as a professional colonial project that began in Europe and the United States in the 19th century and early 20th century, was defined through the transition from the 19th to the 20th century. So once you've set up the problem in the way that I did in the previous slide, you effectively create two broad possibilities for this question of how to apportion similarity and difference, which are, I think, in a kind of perpetual tension in the history of anthropology. And we'll see again and again in the weeks to come these two approaches kind of rubbing up against each other. Now, let me emphasize very, very clearly here that I don't think that any single anthropological theory or any single anthropologist is purely on the one side of this distinction or on the other. These are tendencies, they mix with each other in all sorts of complex and interesting ways. We'll see how that works in the weeks to come with reference to particular topics. But the distinction that I have in mind is one that you perhaps you've already come across in your previous kind of encounters in anthropology, which is the distinction between relativism and universalism. And really, the position of relativism and universalism depends on a really classic way in which anthropologists, and persistent way in which anthropologists have apportioned similarity and difference in their arguments. which is to map difference onto the idea of culture or of society. So cultures and societies can be different from one another, can vary, and similarity to the realm of nature, to the realm of the stuff that we all have in common as human beings, elements that might be biological, they might be psychological, they might be historical, but they are in some sense natural and therefore cut across cultural and social differences, right? So the distinction between nature and culture, or nature and society, provides a kind of matrix through which this problem of how to create a bridge of understanding from one perspective, that of the anthropologist, to the perspective of the people that they study, has been achieved in the history of anthropology. And we'll bump into this distinction again and again. Broadly speaking, the relativistic position is one that says that sure, there might be similarities between people, there might be something called human nature, but that is not relevant to the kinds of questions that anthropologists are interested in deciphering the kind of variety of the human experience, the variations in cultural and social arrangements that one encounters when one does one's work as an anthropologist, right? So one is relativist in the sense that one tries to explain these or account for these cultural variations and differences in their own terms without referring them back to some kind of underlying natural similarity that might explain them. By contrast, the universalist position is the one that does exactly that. It does seek to refer and explain cultural and social variation with reference to underlying mechanisms that are similar and natural. Within the discipline. And I'm just going to give you a very crude and quick example to acquaint you with some really very old stuff in anthropology that goes back to the 19th century, which really predates the way that we do anthropology in the today, based on ethnography in the 20th century. And a lot of this stuff has been kind of thoroughly been debunked or criticized through the history of anthropology. But I thought since this is a theory course with a historical framework guiding it, I should mention this. If you were doing anthropology in the 19th century, the biggest controversy, if I get the word out right, that you would have to take a position with respect to would be the controversy between evolutionist approaches in anthropology and diffusionist approaches in anthropology, right? Those were the two kind of broad theoretical camps, right? So evolutionism was entirely dominant in 19th century UK anthropology, particularly. It was very much a kind of approach that, one of the debates at the time was whether the human species has a single genetic origin or multiple different accounts of, so different subspecies within the human species, a polygenetic account of human diversity, i.e. are the differences between human beings, can they be accounted as differences between different human species? Evolutionist anthropologists were saying that no, this would be wrong, that there's only one lineage of Homo sapiens sapiens, and that the differences that we see in terms of cultural difference in this colonial, thoroughly colonial Victorian time of anthropology that was dominant in the UK could be understood as different stages of evolution of society and culture. So the differences that anthropologists were observing in how people in different parts of the world were living could be organized in a kind of linear evolution from the more primitive to the more advanced and civilized. Now, this is obviously a kind of scientific justification for racism. It is a white supremacist theory of culture and society, which creates effectively a hierarchy between different cultural and social manifestations. But the point that I'm making here, which is perhaps less significant than the politics and the ethics that I just raised, is that this is an example of a universalistic approach because it tries to explain cultural and social diversity with reference to an underlying natural mechanism of evolution, right? So a kind of unifying naturalistic theory of evolution is supposed to account for social and cultural diversity. That's an example of the kind of universalistic approach within anthropology I mentioned before. On the other side of anthropology at the time were the diffusionists, and actually a rather problematic figure in the history of the UCL department, Grafton Elliott Smith, who had a very odd ideas about the origins of culture in Egypt, a kind of justification, I think, again for white supremacy, but in a very different way. He kind of found different pyramids in different parts of the world and tried to establish an account of how it all emanated out of Egypt, which of course was considered to be the cradle of European civilization. That's the point. So that's what makes this very problematic as well from a point of view of the kind of racist origins of anthropological thinking. But also other thinkers such as Franz Boas in the United States, about whom we'll talk about a lot in week 3, Adolf Bastian in Germany, and others, were making the argument that cultural diversity should not be understood as the symptom of underlying natural universalistic processes, but rather as the result of historically contingent ways in which cultural and social configurations travel through human migrations across the world, right? So the differences between different societies and cultures are to be understood in the terms of the differential ways in which these cultural and social traits travel through history. So not in terms of underlying natural processes that are universal, but in terms of contingent, relative to each other, historical processes, right? So human diversity is not a matter of natural development, but one of historical trajectory. All humans are naturally the same. This is the well-known 19th century, not anymore, doctrine of the psychic unity of mankind, which Adolf Bastian was particularly famous for, and others followed him too. So all human beings are united. They have the same psychic capacities, the same cognitive capacities, and the differences between them have to do with migration, with trade, with borrowing traits from each other, with innovations, and so on. They're historical rather than natural phenomena, right? So here we've got a kind of theoretical tussle in 19th century anthropology, which exemplifies these two extremes of universalism versus which run through the history of anthropology, as we'll see in the coming weeks. So just to sum up and wrap up this part of the lecture, there's a tension running through anthropology between universalistic tendencies and relativistic tendencies. The difference can be seen as a difference in focus. Universalistic approaches use similarity to explain difference, while relativistic approaches tend to use difference to critique assumptions about similarity. We'll see a lot of examples of this as we go through the course. There's a difference between methods that the two kind of tendencies tend to employ. The universalistic approach tends to try to generalize through comparison, whereas relativistic approaches make a virtue of particularization and contrasts. They like to contrast and saying, well, you take this for granted, but looking at how people over there do things, you might question your assumptions and so on. There's a difference in the goals, respectively. So a universalistic approach generally tries to be more like natural science and provide explanations for social, cultural, and other human phenomena. Whereas, and kind of tell a causal account, what are the causes that explain things? Whereas relativistic accounts tend to be much more interpretive, they tend to operate much more like the arts do, the humanities. They focus more on meaning, on interpretation. It's more like trying to decipher a novel or a play rather than trying to explain how trajectories of motion of billiard balls or planets might operate, as a physicist might be interested in. Right? And finally, each approach has its own bugbears, its own dangers, its own pitfalls. The pitfall for a universalistic approach is ethnocentrism, possibly the most dirty word in anthropology. What is ethnocentrism? Ethnocentrism is the tendency to project one's own assumptions onto the object that one is trying to understand, the society, the culture, the people that one is trying to understand. Often thinking that the stuff that one assumes in one's own cultural and social environment are natural and universal, right? That's a classic kind of criticism that one can make of many universalistic arguments. Conversely, the pitfall for the relativist is an almost as bad sin, which is exoticism, the overemphasis of difference, othering people, presenting people as if they're so different that you couldn't possibly understand them, denying the recognition, the moments of recognition, the cross-cultural moments of understanding, and so on, in order to exaggerate difference for effect. That can be the sin of a relativistic approach, right? Ultimately, I would say there's a tension here between two contrasting ways of imagining what anthropology is about and why it's important. For the universalistic tendency, anthropology is basically a contribution to science. It's a scientific account of what it is to be human, right? So it's a contribution to the accumulation of our knowledge of the world, if you like. The relativist, on the other hand, has the tendency to see anthropology rather as a window to alternative ways of thinking and living. A position from which the assumptions that people might take for granted can be exposed and criticized. If you like, the trademark of the relativist is their tendency to advance cultural critique, right? To be critical of cultural and social assumptions and show them to be more relative than people are aware of, right? Now, these are only tendencies in anthropology. There's no single anthropologist I can think of who is purely universalistic or purely relativistic. Furthermore, I would add to that I think that the dilemma between universalism and relativism is one that anthropology has begun to overcome for a number of decades now. It's still there. It's still a very useful tool for thinking, for understanding different tendencies within anthropological theory. But it's also a dilemma which is grounded on distinctions that are very much rooted in 20th century thinking, and that in the 21st century, and actually already in the 20th century, were being questioned, and new models for understanding how anthropology might operate, new ways of questioning how the question of similarity and difference might be apportioned in new ways are being developed within anthropology. And I really look forward to examining these with you in the coming weeks. So this is the end of the clips for this week's lecture. I encourage you to do the readings and go to your tutorials and the seminar, and I'll see you in the Q&A lecture on Wednesday if you're an undergrad, and the seminars on Thursday if you're a master's student, which I really, really look forward to. See you later.